Imagine you're standing in a courtroom, right? And you've been accused of inciting a massive riot.
Okay, stressful.
Yeah, very. But instead of, calling witnesses or pulling up security footage to prove your innocence, you just walk up to a chalkboard and start writing out the laws of thermodynamics.
Right, like you just bypass the whole legal timeline entirely. You argue the fundamental physics of reality, demonstrating that mathematically, the crime they're accusing you of is a literal impossibility.
Exactly. I mean, it sounds like bringing a calculator to a knife fight. But this isn't just some crazy thought experiment. A real scientist actually did this after being arrested for retweeting a cartoon to an audience of, well, almost nobody.
Yeah, it's wild. Rather than pleading innocent in the traditional sense, he used advanced mathematics, uh, quantum physics theories, and his own country's constitution to completely dismantle the prosecution's case.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a single, just absolutely fascinating legal case from China. And we've got a dense stack of source material to unpack for you today.
We really do. We're looking at actual indictments, court verdicts, appeals, and this really incredible document known as a blood letter written from a prison cell.
And there's a very modern addition to the sources too, right?
Yes. We also have a meta-analysis of the entire case generated independently by multiple major AI models. So we're talking ChatGPT, Deepseek, Grok, and Gemini, all weighing in on the legal documents.
But before we jump into the physics and the AI, we really need to set some ground rules for this deep dive. Our sources contain some highly politically charged content regarding the Chinese judicial system.
Right, and it's important to state our mission here. We are going to impartially report and synthesize what these legal documents and the artificial intelligences are actually saying.
Yeah, we are not taking sides. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the original creators of these social media posts, and we aren't endorsing the authorities involved either. We're simply serving as your guides to unpack this really extraordinary collision of complex systems, physics, and state power.
Exactly. So let's get into it. The protagonist at the center of all this documentation is Dr. Chen Jingyuan. He's an independent scholar, and he holds a PhD in complex systems.
Okay.
And the timeline in our indictment starts in September 2022. Dr. Chen's home in Kunming was raided by local authorities. He was arrested, subjected to a secret trial, and then ultimately sentenced to 20 months in prison.
Okay, let's unpack this right away, because if they are raiding a complex systems physicist's home and holding a secret trial, I mean, you'd think they charged him with something massive, right? Like state espionage or orchestrating a massive cyber attack.
You would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
But the official charge listed in the verdict is, quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Wait, what? Picking quarrels? That
Yeah.
sounds like a citation you get for being too loud at a pub, not something that triggers a secret trial.
Right, it sounds trivial, but the AI analyses and the defense documents both highlight a very specific term for this in Chinese law. They call it a pocket crime.
A pocket crime?
Yeah. It functions as this highly elastic catch-all statute. So when authorities want to penalize an action, but it doesn't cleanly fit into the actual definitions of subversion or fraud, they just stretch the boundaries of the statute and, stuff the behavior into that pocket.
Okay, so what was the behavior they stuffed into the pocket in Dr. Chen's case?
It was his activity on a Twitter account, which he accessed via a VPN. The prosecution alleged that his activity caused a, quote, severe disorder of public order.
A severe disorder of public order. I mean, when I read that in the sources, I pictured some massive influencer mobilizing millions of people to flood the streets.
But that's the thing. The logs in our sources show Dr. Chen had fewer than 100 followers.
Less than 100.
Yeah. And the defense even submitted evidence that these were mostly zombie fans, inactive accounts or bots. He wasn't even posting original commentary most of the time. He was just using the platform as sort of a digital filing cabinet, occasionally hitting the retweet button.
Right. The indictment lists retweets of, what was it, a political cartoon depicting an umbrella girl from the Hong Kong protests.
Yep, that was one. And a speech by Donald Trump criticizing communism, plus just some various standard updates from the U.S. Embassy.
So wait. For the court to convict him of causing severe public disorder, they needed to prove he was intentionally spreading rumors.
Exactly. They had to prove malicious intent. And the logical leap the court made to achieve this is honestly, it's one of the most baffling things in these documents.
It really is.
The verdict explicitly states that because Dr. Chen holds a PhD because he has a high education level, he should have implicitly known the information in those retweets was false.
Wait, so the court is saying his PhD makes him guilty? That's like getting a speeding ticket while your car is parked simply because you own a sports car.
That's a great analogy. The defense documents actually categorize this reasoning as a formal category mistake. The court took a scholar's cognitive capability and just weaponized it as proof of malicious intent.
Which is wild.
And it gets worse. They took subjective expressions like a political cartoon and judged them by the standards of objective, verifiable facts. You just can't empirically fact-check a drawing of a girl with an umbrella.
No, you can't. It's like failing a calculus exam because your handwriting is messy. You're applying the metric of one entirely unrelated category to judge another.
Right.
So this naturally leads to a huge question. If a local court can just invent a crime by twisting a scholar's intellect against him, what is the point of having a national constitution at all? Like, does the foundational law actually allow a local authority to operate this way?
Well, that tension is exactly why the AI meta-analysis section of our sources is so revealing. Researchers took the raw facts of the case, fed them into multiple large language models, and asked the AIs to analyze the convictions strictly against the text of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China.
And the divergence in how the different AIs approach this is just fascinating. So let's start with Deepseek and Quinn.
Right, those are the Chinese-developed models.
Yep. Exactly. They zeroed in on Article 35, which is the guarantee of freedom of speech, and Article 47, which protects academic freedom. They basically framed his Twitter use as standard academic information gathering.
Which is a very logical, safe framing for those models. They assess the mechanism of his actions, curating and saving diverse viewpoints, and determined it falls under protected academic research.
But then you look at Gemini and Copilot, the Western-developed models, and they shift the focus entirely. They look at the enforcement mechanism itself.
Yeah, they cite Article 38, which protects human dignity, and Article 33, equality before the law. They focused heavily on the selective targeting of the whole thing.
Right, because the original creators of the cartoon and the speeches weren't arrested. News outlets that summarize the exact same events weren't penalized at all.
Exactly. The AIs flag that targeting a lone academic with 80 bot followers just for clicking a button violates the basic premise of equal legal application.
So what does this all mean? We have a stack of different AI models, all independently looking at this case, and they are uniformly using the country's own foundational laws to critique the local court. Is the law protecting him or punishing him?
Well, Grok's analysis synthesizes this really well by introducing the concept of the dual track. The AI noted that authoritarian legal frameworks often operate on two parallel tracks.
Okay, break that down for me.
So track one is the Constitution on paper. It looks solemn, it's internationally acceptable, and it guarantees fundamental rights.
Like freedom of speech and equality before the law.
Exactly. But track two is the practical application at the local level. That's where those written protections are completely bypassed to execute a specific mandate from authorities.
So every single AI model, regardless of its training data or national origin, independently read the country's foundational law and concluded the local court abused it. The artificial intelligence looked at a human justice system and immediately identified a logical short circuit.
Yeah. And confronted with a legal system operating on that arbitrary second track, Dr. Chen pivoted. He realized if the local authorities were playing a game where the rules could just be altered at will, he needed to mount a defense using rules that cannot be altered by anyone.
The laws of physics.
Exactly. He used complex systems physics to prove his retweets lacked the physical capacity to cause the disorder he was accused of.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. I read this section of the defense files, and I'm definitely going to need you to translate something. He submitted a defense based on the Galton-Watson branching process. What is that, and how does it prove you didn't start a riot?
Okay, so think of how epidemiologists track a virus. They use a metric called R0 to determine how many people one infected person will pass the virus to, right?
Yeah, we heard a lot about that a few years ago.
Right. Well, the Galton-Watson branching process is a mathematical model used to study how anything propagates through a network. It could be a disease or it could be a piece of information. And in this model, the key metric is called mu, which is the average branching number.
Okay, so if I tell two people a secret, and they each tell two people, the mu is 2, and the information cascades exponentially.
Correct. So Dr. Chen pulled his Twitter analytics and mathematically demonstrated that because his engagement was virtually non-existent, his mu was a tiny fraction well below 1.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In the language of physics, his specific node in the network existed in what's called a deep subcritical zone. When mu is less than 1, the mathematical probability of propagation causing a systemic cascade is exactly 0.
Zero.
0. The probability of extinction, meaning the information simply dies out without spreading, is 100%.
So he's not just saying, I didn't do it. He's using thermodynamics to prove he was just lighting a match in a vacuum. Even if the retweet was intended to be a spark, the environment around it physically prevented combustion.
Exactly. And he built on that by introducing Cohen's threshold formula, which deals with network topology. A platform like Twitter is a scale-free network.
Meaning it's not evenly distributed.
Right. It doesn't look like a uniform grid. It looks like a few massive hubs connected to millions of tiny, isolated spokes. The hubs are supernodes accounts with millions of followers. Dr. Chen mathematically defined his account as a long-tail edge node.
Meaning he is the absolute furthest spoke from the center of the network. He's on the extreme outer edge.
Yep. And the formula proves that in a scale-free network, removing or activating a random long-tail edge node has zero structural impact on the overall system. You could delete his account entirely, or he could retweet 100 cartoons a day, and the macro structure of the network remains totally unaffected.
So if his node couldn't possibly affect the system, how does a severe disorder of public order actually happen, according to the physics he cited?
He explained that through self-organized criticality, or SOC. The classic way to visualize SOC is a sand pile. If you keep dropping grains of sand one by one into a pile, the pile grows steeper and steeper. Eventually, one single grain will cause the entire side of the pile to collapse in an avalanche.
But you can't really blame that one specific grain of sand for the whole avalanche, can you?
That is exactly the point. The avalanche is actually caused by immense systemic pressures building up over time. The geometry of the pile itself becomes inherently unstable.
Right.
SOC dictates that an avalanche only happens if the entire system is already hypercritical. Dr. Chen argued that a system-level collapse is never caused by a single edge node unless the macro system is so fragile and unstable that it is perpetually on the verge of failure anyway.
Oh, that is brilliant. If the state is claiming his 80 zombie followers caused a severe public disorder, they are inadvertently admitting that their entire society is a hypercritical sand pile ready to collapse at the slightest breeze.
It's a huge self-own by the prosecution. You see this profound disconnect occurring in the courtroom. You have the language of science, which requires empirical data, structural mapping, probability.
Yeah.
And it is colliding head-on with the language of unchecked power, which requires only subjective labels and forced outcomes.
Because science requires a demonstrable mechanism, but power just requires a mandate. And spoiler alert for you listening in this case, the mandate won.
Sadly, yes.
Despite this airtight scientific defense proving physical impossibility and a constitutional defense proving legal overreach, Dr. Chen's appeal was rejected without a trial. The 20-month sentence was upheld.
And the source documents provide a deeply disturbing context for that rejection. During the legal process, a prosecutor allegedly had a conversation with Dr. Chen's lawyer.
Oh yeah, the ironclad conversation.
Right. The prosecutor actually admitted that the local authorities were aware the case lacked substance. However, the prosecutor stated that, quote, upper leadership specifically instructed to make this an ironclad case, noting that they had to, metaphorically speaking, put him to death.
The mandate didn't care about mu or branching processes or constitutional tracks. Dr. Chen realized he wasn't navigating a justice system anymore. He was dealing with what he termed a judicial mafia.
A judicial mafia?
Yeah, a syndicate utilizing the aesthetics of a courtroom just to execute a predetermined order.
And this realization is what prompted him to write what the documents refer to as the prison blood letter. He was confined in the Kunming prison, fully aware that his scientific arguments had fallen on deaf ears and that the guards would probably refuse to even mail his writing.
But he wrote it anyway.
He wrote it anyway. He addressed it not to the judges who convicted him, but to future readers, framing the letter as a civilization diagnostic report.
I want you to think about that for a second. If you strip a scientist of his freedom, ignore his empirical evidence, and lock him in a concrete box, how does he maintain his sanity? Like, what do you even write in a diagnostic report about a system that actively denies physics?
You lean on the absolute foundation of logic. In the blood letter, Dr. Chen cited Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Okay, I know this is a titan of a concept in mathematics, but you're going to have to walk me through how a prisoner uses it against a state.
Sure. So in the early 20th century, mathematicians really wanted to prove that all of mathematics could be perfectly boxed up into a complete, consistent set of rules where every true statement could be proven.
A perfect closed loop.
Exactly. But Kurt Gödel shattered that dream. He proved mathematically that in any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that simply cannot be proven within the rules of that system.
So a system basically cannot prove its own consistency. There is always going to be a blind spot.
Always. No system can be perfectly closed, absolutely complete, and entirely consistent all at once. It's mathematically impossible. So Dr. Chen took this inescapable mathematical law and applied it to political ideology.
Oh, wow.
He diagnosed that the state's legal and political framework was attempting to present itself as a perfectly closed, absolute loop of truth.
But Gödel proves the absolute loop is an illusion.
Precisely. Dr. Chen argued that there will always be flaws, contradictions, and truths that exist outside the state's approved logic. By imprisoning a scholar for merely exploring viewpoints outside that closed loop, the system wasn't just violating human rights, it was fundamentally warring against mathematical reality.
He is sitting in a prison cell, basically telling the architects of his imprisonment, your system demands to be absolute, and the underlying math of the universe proves you are chasing an illusion. I mean, it is this desperate, brilliant plea for rationality in the face of arbitrary force.
It really is. It serves as this remarkable testament to a human mind's capacity to seek structural truth and order, even when it's completely engulfed by a system that refuses to acknowledge either.
This deep dive really forces you to look at your own daily reality differently. We all leave a digital footprint. For you, the listener, the simple, thoughtless act of hitting retweet on a funny political cartoon, it's just a mundane part of modern life.
Right, we do it every day.
But this case is a masterclass in how fragile objective truth becomes when power dictates reality. It shows how quickly a tiny digital spark can collide with the full, crushing weight of a state apparatus.
And I think it also leaves us with a really profound question about the future of how we analyze these collisions. Throughout this deep dive, we've dissected human bias, systemic fragility, and the abuse of authority.
Yeah.
But reflect for a moment on the AI analyses we discussed earlier. Multiple artificial intelligences, entirely devoid of political ambition, fear, or the pressure of upper leadership, analyzed a human legal system.
And in seconds, they dispassionately identified its logical failures and constitutional violations. They mapped the category mistake and the dual track without any hesitation.
They saw the structural flaws that the human judges were either unable to see or forced to ignore.
Yeah, they did.
So as we move further into a digitally integrated future, it raises this possibility. Will artificial intelligence become the ultimate impartial diagnostic tool for human rights? Will machines be the ones to reliably see through the political noise, the systemic corruption, and the manipulated logic that human systems so often fall prey to? It is a complex proposition to mull over long after you finish listening today.
It really is a striking thought to leave on. Maybe the next time a citizen is standing in a courtroom accused of the mathematically impossible, they won't need to sketch out complex systems theory on a chalkboard. Maybe an AI will have already audited the system and proven the math for them.
Keep diving deep.